Welcome to HR Masters, a podcast where we sit down and talk about key learnings and best practices with the masters of human resources. Find us through Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, and other platforms. Now sit back, turn it up, and get ready to get your masters in HR with our host, Jordi Romero.
Welcome to HR Masters. Today we have with us Dan Kragt. Dan, it's a pleasure to have you. How are you doing?
Hi, Jordi. Nice to be there.
So Dan has a really impressive and extensive experience. So I would like himself to introduce us a little bit to what you've been up to so far.
Yeah, sure. Well, let's try to keep it short. Before joining Quipu as a CEO, I've been involved close to 20 years in developing what is possibly one of the largest corporate administrative services companies in the world, called TMF Group. I started off real small with a small gestoria here in Barcelona, and sold that business to this group that was expanding internationally. And after 20 years of efforts with many people on board, close to 7,000 by the time I left the company a little over a year ago, the company was established in over 90 countries with 120 offices, all providing corporate administrative services, mainly accounting, a little bit of legal administration, and then quite a bit of payroll.
Okay, so you're not a typical HR professional, are you?
No, the HR sort of caught me instead of me catching HR.
So tell us a little bit more about what you mean by this, professional corporate administrative services from an HR perspective. What role do you play in the HR life of a company that would be a customer of your previous company?
Yeah, so what you see is there's a sort of a specific profile of company that outsources administrative duties, right? And what you mostly see is that the corporations tend to divide that into three main areas. It's the financial area, that has everything to do with the financial administration, the bookkeeping, taxes. That's a very specific area where a lot of outsourcing or outside expertise is required by companies of any size to get things right. From a local compliance point of view, the local tax requirements, local legal requirements. So the financial area is a definite area. Then there's the legal administration. There's a number of minimal legal requirements most corporations or business professionals need to comply with to be properly registered. Insurance, licenses sometimes come to play, local taxes directly related to the business activity, which is almost a legal obligation rather than a tax obligation. Mm-hmm. And then, of course, there's the whole area of human resources. That's important in any company, but especially in the fast-growing, more service-oriented organizations, the HR component is really important as it's the service and the business is about people. So that's one thing that needs to be administrated extremely well from a formal point of view, but also from a talent management and an economic management point of view. It needs to be administrated very well.
So focusing on this last area of the three, which is the whole what we call payroll services, what would you typically do for your customers in this area? Was HR your customer, or was like the CEO or a different part of the company buying your services?
Well, that's actually varies quite a bit on the industries and the sizes of the companies. I think the HR role is growing in responsibility and in recognition very, very rapidly at the moment. But what you still see in quite a few small and middle-sized companies is that the HR role is sort of either hidden away with the general manager or with the finance department. In general, if it's with the finance department, it's because they have taken on the administrative obligation of paying and possibly making or outsourcing the pay slips. And so the financial area also takes care of it. But I would say, fortunately, for most companies now, there is a specific HR responsible, and it's quite it requires quite a bit of specific knowledge. It's not just a matter of paying people on time and filing papers on time. This is an area that requires quite a little bit of specialty knowledge, which especially by the small and the middle-sized companies is often underestimated.
Absolutely. So, staying in this area, you mentioned a couple of times like small and medium companies, and you mentioned the complexity or the specialty of these roles that your previous team had to fulfill for these customers. When do you think it makes sense to outsource or use a partner like TMF or Factorial for that matter for all your HR administrative tasks, and when does it make sense to bring this in-house and build your own team?
Well, there's a number of things that maybe never make sense to have it in-house. Because if you deal, for instance, with a lot of countries, to make sure that you have all that expertise in-house that's a gigantic task and a gigantic risk. So so if you operate in various countries, I would strongly recommend you would always have an external partner at least supporting you, but probably outsourcing a large part of it would be a smart idea, right? On a local level, I think it's not just a matter of size. It depends how smart you want to be with your resources. And I think the smarter companies nowadays, they recognize that if they outsource more, they can use their in-source resources better. So instead of building a full service, full knowledge department in-house, what you do is you get the right skills on board to do those business critical elements around certain profiles or certain specific knowledge required in your sector that you want to control yourself. But the other HR functions can be largely taken care of by a very good platform, and if that platform is done properly supported with good professionals, both on the client side and on the service provider side, I think that's a stronger solution than trying to do everything in house, especially the small to middle size.
I'm obviously biased to support this assessment, considering that's our bread and butter. But let's try to find in which cases it does make sense to internalize this. Did you find some use cases where you would advise a client or a prospect, you should just do this yourself? It would make more sense for you to run your own payroll and so on.
Well, there's certain sectors where it's more complicated for an external party to add a lot of value from an HR point of view, but they can still add a lot of value from a data processing point of view, right? So I think if you work in more an industrial or manufacturing activity, where people have irregular working hours, specifics around certain risks that have to do with certain positions or overtimes, or specific holiday periods or requirements that need to be fulfilled, and it makes it basically no pay slip is the same 1 month after another, and there's a lot of day-to-day input about when people come, when people go, or whether they've been absent, whether they've been working in certain specific contractual conditions. Then it can make a lot of sense to have more in-house power, but still the whole production of the payroll process at the end of the month, together with the payments, can still be very price-wise to outsource that.
So you would never basically hire like a payroll specialist or a payroll technician in-house under no circumstances?
if it is to have enough information to work with the outside party, and to have a good sparring partner in-house to work with the outside party, I think that that makes a lot of sense. And it's not the same thing, if you have a head of HR together with some supporting staff, for the recruitment and training processes that in a company they might be running, and they will have a lot of HR knowledge. But one thing is HR management from a talent and succession and recruitment point of view, and the other thing is managing HR from an admin obligations point of view. And I think it's a waste of talent to use qualified professionals to do the admin part when they should be doing the management part.
I couldn't agree more. So I want to jump to, you mentioned a lot as well, the local branches and international, multinational companies. But before we get there, you said you've been like 20 years or almost 20 years, in this industry, in very significant executive roles at one of the biggest companies in the world who provides these services. How have you seen technology change this? Like, were there any breakthroughs that said, like, okay, now this completely changed how companies run payroll, how companies outsource their compliance obligations?
It has been slow, to be honest, and I think the last 5 years really have made significant steps. Before that, it was more of the same, if I can sort of describe it like that. Yes, I think if any service industry has made great efforts to automate functions and to control massive amounts of data in a structured format, it's probably the payroll industry. So that's so the payroll industry, I think, has always enjoyed a high level of automation. I think there's very little countries where you could still, especially in developed economies, where you could run a payroll without a specialist program that you have contracted for that, whether with inside use or being used outside by an outside provider, right? But it's generally a software solution based service. And what I think has changed most in the last 5 years is where people understand that software should sit and how they should communicate with it, right? So before this was preferably on your own server in your own company. That then obviously for smaller companies puts a bit of strain, because there's a lot of data there, a lot of backup required, a lot of security required, data protection having and privacy regulations having increased enormously. So to do that all by yourself and having that sitting on your own server and being yourself responsible, whether in a network format or in a pure local to local format, making sure that you're keeping up not only with the software requirements for all the regulations from a payroll point of view, but also around the data security, the data privacy issues. I think that those are just additional arguments now to leave it to specialized parties. And what you see is that the payroll suppliers come with those problems resolved, right? So the data is stored in secure places, the data is organized, and so the contracting is done in a way that it's all compliant with the new data protection laws. And I think that's from a company to assure that for yourself is already quite a risk, because this is quite specialty knowledge and very specific. If you're on top of it, working in various countries at the same time, that risk goes exponential, because although we have an EU, none of the countries have resolved this issue in the same way. So you really need to make sure that you're compliant, depending on where you're operating. So it makes an awful lot of sense to keep external parties involved, and technology has played now a much bigger role in making sure that we can deal with all those obligations. So yes, I think the last 5 years much more tendency to have the data and the software sitting outside the house, and now with the with the options of cloud solutions, it has really become something very accessible for small to middle-sized companies, because before this was sort of seen as accessible only by the big guys, and that's no longer.
There is one thing that it's interesting. You're focusing a lot on the infrastructure, no? On the actual server you need to host in your own, on your own premises, the security compliance and so on, consequences of it, which are great. The cloud has changed all of that. But I didn't hear you mention one, maybe by accident, dramatic change that happened, which is that because this software is not sitting in the outsourcing firm's desk, this software is now in the cloud, there is suddenly more users that can access it, no? And then suddenly we have the final company with their financial guy, their HR person, the middle managers, and maybe even the employees who can somehow access this data and either contribute to the information or run reports. That has been for us, for instance, at Factorial, one of the key pillars of why we exist, is because we want to use this, already established technology, which is the cloud, to say, it's not just the same, but in the cloud. It's the cloud enables us to have, the employee requesting a variable.
That's what I meant to say, that it's now accessible to small and medium-sized companies, right? This was sort of seen as a necessity for larger companies, and the larger companies were getting more people involved, but they were using their own resources, basically their networks, to do that. That was not at the really available for the small and middle-sized company. Now the small and middle-sized companies can have as many people participate as they want, because they don't have this infrastructure limitation anymore, right?
Yeah,
absolutely. And this is a game changer. Like the whole workflow and the whole process and information flow is different. So going back to the main topic, which we wanted to discuss, one of the interesting experiences that you've worked a lot with is handling compliance at a very high level, no? Like specific then to legal, tax, and accounting and payroll for many different locations. So how do you solve that? What does it actually mean when one of your previous customers said, I have branches in 20 different countries and I want to operate more or less in a same way overall? How do you handle that?
Well, yeah, it's mostly not getting lost in the midst of the diversity that that comes jumping at you.
Diversity is a very nice way of putting it.
It's the reality, though, is that people and countries have much more in common than we like to think when we start thinking about it, right? So, if you, for instance, look at how a contract relation and a payslip is. Comes about, and you compare it all over the globe, you find actually minimal differences in how it comes about, right? There's a number of elements in the contract that are reflected on the payslip, and there's a number of elements in the local legislation that are reflected in the payslip. And if you start grouping them, you see that that they basically all fall into similar groups. It's more a matter of mapping it all to a maybe generally accepted vocabulary, which is that groups these different elements. But the principles around the elements of the payslip and whether it's contractual or local requirements that create those components is that's pretty much the same philosophy everywhere. So if you focus on what's the same, that helps a lot. What on the other hand complicates it is not just the fact that there's a lot of local differences, but from the moment you start servicing more than one location for a client, you get a three-way communication that is difficult to manage, because the client has their sort of headquarters or regional headquarters with the local office communication. Then they have their regional headquarters with the service provider communication. But then there is also a lot of communication between the local office of the supplier and the local office of the client. And to make sure that, you know, those three are totally in sync is not easy, because at the end the work is done quite a bit locally between people that understand the local legislation, that are often in the same city or in the same geography, speak the same language, and then the coordinating office for the service supplier and the coordinating office for the client, and they can have agreed a lot of things and have understood one thing, but then when it comes really, when the rubber hits the road on the local level, you know, that you can finally see how much of that sort of global understanding was equally understood locally, and whether they're getting along with it.
So what you're saying is that from the two layers of complexity, or the two layers that need to be globalized, one of them would be the information structure, which you say you can abstract, or you can do this grouping that you said you figured it out, and it's not such a big deal as most people tend to think. I think you're simplifying it because you've been doing this for over 20 years. But then there is this other layer which you probably cannot figure out and you cannot solve, which is the customer itself and the way they communicate, and basically like the problem you're stating has nothing to do with payroll, or has nothing to do with these corporate administrative services. It's just like purely multinational company communication challenges.
Yeah, I guess as soon as you go multi-country, the multinational companies, that always sounds like it needs to be big, but there's a lot of companies that have international activities that are, you know, not the typical multinationals. And I would say that that's probably what has been driving global growth most in the last decade, is that all these smaller to mid-sized companies, thanks to technology advances, can really pretend to compete in other markets, or source themselves from other markets, which before was really, you know, a privilege of the larger organizations.
Absolutely, that's an interesting global trend, no? That probably brings new opportunity for a company like TMF. And but I think you kind of minimized one of the challenges. But knowing a little bit the industry, I'm sure it's not so easy to figure out. A lot of the things you mentioned, there is local laws, there is local tax calculations, there is local clauses in contracts that only apply in one part of the planet and not in the other. How did you figure this out? Like, did you need local teams all over the world, and then they needed to use like some sort of local software or calculation tools to do that, and then they brought that into the common language platform? Or how did you figure this out?
Yeah, well, there's different solutions, right? But at TMF at the time, what we chose for sort of best of breed local solutions, and making sure that they all complied with a number of things around, the type of technology, accessibility, security, but also data exchange facilities. And then basically from those local platforms, pull up the data to put it into a sort of a homogenizer, sort of a mixer that makes it all come out in one specific format. And that was a format that worked for TMF, mainly because TMF had local offices everywhere. I think that was the sort of the great added value of that. Of the company, that network of local experts everywhere, and not
so your own company was
sort of an example of this kind of company you're saying that was able to grow globally with multiple local branches and having people on the field.
Yeah, we ate enormously of our own medicine.
How many people were you?
So at the end it was over 7,000 people.
Okay.
Operating out of slightly over 100 locations. So
wow.
And average size of office, probably still under 100 people, but with a few offices with a couple of hundred people, and a number of offices with where there would be 50 or less person is active. But from an administration services team, those are already teams that are quite sizable to manage from a day-to-day workload and obligations aspects point of view.
Interesting. So before we wrap up, Dan, we talked a lot about your experience over these 20 years managing corporate administration services, globally, multinationally. But tell us a little bit about your current challenge. What is Quipu and what are you trying to achieve there?
In Quipu, this is a very interesting offering because it's looking at a very different way to how to deal with your financial needs and with your financial control. The traditional way has always been to look at bookkeeping and do your bookkeeping, and then once you've got your bookkeeping done, see what does the bookkeeping tell you, right? And
what does it tell you usually?
Well, the thing is that bookkeeping is based on a system that is a few hundred years old, double entry bookkeeping, which is a very good control mechanism to basically use almost a chemistry principle to money, and nothing is created and nothing is lost. But
it's kind of magic. It's kind of magic when you get it.
But it's not very. I think the next generations will not be very keen on learning such a limited and putting so many obligations and limitations on the way you work with data, and it's also not very intuitive, right? It has a number of concepts that are a little bit remote of everyday life. So Quipu has really taken a look at how does an everyday business deal with their obligations of invoicing, collecting money, paying taxes, knowing how much money is in the bank, how much is still to come, how much is still to pay. All those very practical day-to-day things that if you don't get them right, your business is in trouble. And basically where you also cannot wait for your bookkeeper to come back somewhere end of 2 months later, telling you that, somewhere halfway March, that January was not a good month. That's probably then getting late to get things fixed. So
so you're probably, in my own words, making accounting useful again.
Yeah, or it's different. It's a different way of doing accounting, I think. You could even argue whether it's still doing accounting, actually.
Okay, that was very interesting, Dan. We'll have to leave it here. Thank you so much for joining our podcast, and I hope our audience enjoys your experience.
Thanks for having me, Jordi.
Have a good day.
If you liked this, subscribe to our channel and don't forget to tune in next week to HR Masters.